Hello, everyone. My presentation today has to do with balancing health and sustainability in the diet. Let's start with the first slide. This is a challenge. How do we approach this challenge? How do we define healthy diets? And how do we define sustainable diets? The outline of my presentation is going to be on the next slide. Let's go to that. What are those diets? You will find out that there are many metrics of diet quality, and those are adequacy, moderation, diversity, and balance. My position is that protein quality is a key component of healthy diets, and here we have various metrics of protein quality. I will also want to measure impact on the environment and suggest the way forward, both for the consumers and for the food industry. What behavior changes are necessary and what will be the impact on nutritional advice to the consumer. And then finally, what are some practical take-home messages? But let's talk first of all about health and sustainability. This is going to be on the next slide. Is it possible that we have misunderstood sustainability altogether? Because health and sustainability actually go hand in hand. Healthy diets are defined as nutrient-rich diets that are optimal for human growth, health, and well-being. Sustainable diets have been talked about as diets with low impact on the environment. But in fact, sustainability is much more than that. So then the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has been using the phrase healthy and sustainable diets, or healthy diets from sustainable food systems, or sustainable healthy diets. But as you will see in the next slide, there are actually 4 dimensions of sustainability and not just 2. So this is a very important point. When we talk about sustainable diets, it's not just a question of nutrition and the environment. There is much more to it, because the 4 components are going to be health, economics, society, and the environment. 4 dimensions and not just 2. We're talking about nutrition and health, yes, but also food prices, affordability, but also impact on the environment, but also the value of different types of foods to society. So I'll be saying this again. There are 4 sustainability domains, and sometimes we mistakenly think there are only 2. Remember, health, economics, society, and the environment. And for each of those dimensions, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has written reports and published papers, and all of this is well documented in the scientific literature. So let's go on to the next slide, which shows you that those 4 domains are not really additive. They can be in conflict. And this is why I'm talking about the balancing of health and sustainability and economics and societal value. Trade-offs have to be made. Let me outline this point. First of all, nutrient-rich foods, the constituents of a healthy diet, they generally are more expensive and they do have a higher environmental cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, land and water use. And here we're talking about animal protein from meat or from dairy. So nutrient-dense foods, higher environmental cost and higher monetary cost. Now, if you want to go to low-cost foods, those are going to be added sugar and vegetable oil. They are cheap, but not necessarily nutritious. But they are cheaper than animal proteins. And yes, they do have a lower carbon footprint, but they do not really do you any favors nutritionally. So empty calories such as sugar have low impact on land use, water use, and energy use, but they are low nutrient density. Livestock, on the other hand, has higher impact, but we'll see whether or not it's worth it. I say it is. And then there's a social component. As people get richer, they abandon diets of stable carbohydrates and they want more animal protein, especially meat. And that is a phenomenon that has been called Bennett's Law, formulated in 1941. We'll talk more about that as well. So let's go to the next slide and summarize the FAO position on sustainable diets. This is a sentence which could only have been written by a committee. The FAO says that sustainable diets are nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, affordable, culturally acceptable, accessible, protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, and optimizing natural and human resources. But basically, it's back to the 4 dimensions: nutrition, affordability, economics, cultural acceptance, society, and then biodiversity and ecosystems, meaning the environment. So going back some years, the Italian company Barilla came up with a very influential double pyramid. You notice you have the pyramid on the left, the nutritional pyramid. You have the inverted environmental pyramid, showing that the foods at the top are actually more environmentally intrusive or have a higher environmental impact. I say that we ought to have 3 pyramids. That's my own triple pyramid, which really looks at the economic component: health equity, affordability, cultural acceptance, human resources, and let's not forget farm health. So single nutrition pyramid, double environmental inverted pyramid, and a third socioeconomic pyramid. But FAO forgot about one component. Let's go on to the next slide. FAO published a very interesting set of principles for healthy, sustainable diets. That was in 2019, and I was in Rome for that. And take a look here. There are a number of components, 16 of them. They deal with health, environment, and society. What is missing? What is missing is affordability. There's no mention here at all about affordable foods, and we just said there are 4 components: health, society, and the environment, but also economics, affordability. It is not there in the FAO document, but it ought to be. So let's go on to the next slide. And here you see that the FAO actually had some ideas about diet quality. It was about restricting highly processed foods and beverages, dealing with minimally processed foods, including only moderate amounts of eggs and dairy and small amounts of red meat, but including a great deal of grains, whole grains, legumes, nuts, fruits and vegetables, and so on. And to me, those recommendations, I'm sorry to say, make very little sense. Why? Let's go on to the next slide. I'm saying that the insistence of fresh and minimally processed foods goes absolutely against the FAO concept of affordable nutrient density. It's not enough for foods to be nutrient rich. They also have to be affordable. And then the limitation on eggs and dairy makes no sense. In fact, FAO has been promoting both in Africa, both dairy and chickens. So here you have this difficult balancing act. How do we balance health with affordability and with environmental impact? So going back to my 4 dimensions, I say that sustainable, healthy diets need to be nutrient-rich, affordable, socially acceptable, and with low impact on the environment. And the big question is, are there any such foods or diets that come close to this definition? And I say, well, it's going to be very difficult, but milk and dairy come very close. Let's go on to the next slide. So how do we measure diet quality? This actually is an interesting topic. Diet quality is composed of a number of components. High-quality diets have nutrient-rich foods, as you see here. Those are nutrient-rich foods. But the elements of diet quality are slightly different, and you will see them on the next slide. I'm using the pyramid as a metaphor. The reason I like a pyramid is because it gives you a visual representation of the various concepts of adequacy at the bottom, moderation at the top, and balance and diversity on the side. So take a look with me at the pyramid. Adequacy is at the bottom of the pyramid, and here you have grains and whole grains and cereals and vegetables and fruit. Moderation is at the apex of the pyramid. Added fats, added sugars, and sodium to be consumed in moderation. Balance suggests that all those food groups ought to be consumed in the right proportions. I think the plate on the bottom right gives you some idea of the balance of food components. Plate gives you the idea of balance, but not necessarily hierarchy. And then on the left, you have diversity, and that would include variety of foods within food group, but also making sure that foods from all food groups are being consumed. So the four components of diet quality: adequacy, moderation, balance, and diversity. And again, there are metrics for all of those. For example, Nutri-Score, a nutrient profiling system, focuses on calories, fat, sugar, and salt. Other nutrient profiling systems deal more with adequacy and nutrient balance. Let's go on to the next slide, which actually shows you that animal proteins are very often a proxy for diet quality, especially in low and middle income countries. So this is a score from FAO about minimum dietary diversity for women. It's based on a number of questions, and the question is, have you eaten any of those foods within the past 24 hours or indeed lately? And many people in low-income countries may have consumed plenty of starchy staples and nothing else. The average score is like 5 out of 10. My students in the United States were perfectly nourished, having consumed most of those foods with the possible exception of organ meats. People don't eat much liver in the United States, but generally organ meats are a very rich source of nutrients. So notice here that the indices of diet quality, very rich in vitamins and in minerals, are organ meats. Then you have meat and fish for high quality protein. Then you have eggs, and then you have milk and milk products. So animal foods are actually a proxy for a healthy diet. Let's go on to the next slide, where I start looking at the quality and the amount of proteins consumed. So this is very interesting. These are data on protein supply, not consumption, from the FAO. People very often take those data as equivalent to consumption. They are not, but they're really a good proxy. So take a look at France and the United States. The amount of protein consumed daily is in the order of 120 grams per person per day. Again, this is supply, not necessarily consumption. Notice that most of the protein is from animal source foods. Between 60 to 68% of protein in rich countries is from animal source foods. I should say that the percentage in Malaysia is going to be about 66% as well. Notice also that the daily requirement from protein is about 50 grams per day. So the rich countries consume more than twice the recommended amount. Now, as you go down below to South Africa and Chad and India and Nigeria, you start seeing that the amount of total protein decreases sharply. For example, in Indonesia, it would be below 70 grams per person per day. And then notice also that most of the protein now is not from animal sources at all. It is now plant protein. That makes a whole big difference to protein quality. So as you go down the socioeconomic scale, from France, United States, down to India and Nigeria, you see lower consumption of protein, and you see much, much lower consumption of animal protein. And the type of animal protein changes as well. Let's go on to the next slide. This slide shows you where the available protein is coming from. Again, I can't overemphasize, these are supply data, not consumption. But you see in the United States, you have poultry and pork and quite a bit of beef, and then eggs and dairy. In France, you have less poultry, less beef, but much more dairy, yogurt and cheese. The French love their cheese, we knew that. Then you go into Spain, famous for pork. You see higher consumption of pork. And then as you go down the socioeconomic scale to lower income places in Africa, in some cases in Asia, you see great reduction in the amount of animal protein. And notice that a lot of protein is now coming from other sources. You have fish and seafood in some cases. And then, for example, in India, you have dairy. And in Nigeria, the total consumption of animal protein is around 6.5 grams, and most of it is coming from fish and seafood. So huge, enormous disparities in animal protein consumption as a function of country incomes. Let's go on to the next slide. And the point I'm trying to make is that all of this is absolutely consistent with the famous law of economics. It's called Bennett's Law. Bennett's Law states that as countries become richer, they abandon diets with root crops and potatoes and yams and cassava and even rice. And instead, they want more meat and they want more dairy products. So on this slide, you see on the left, a decline in the consumption of potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, and cassava on the left, and a huge increase in chicken, pork, and beef, to a lesser extent sheep, on the right. Here, the countries have been arranged into World Bank income categories. Low income, less than $1,000 per capita per year. High income, $13,000 per capita per year, and everything else in between. So huge disparities again in consumption of plant-based proteins and animal proteins. And of course, the issue is that plant-based proteins are more sustainable from the environmental viewpoint, but do not necessarily have the same quality or the same nutrient density. Let's move on to the next slide, which will illustrate the difference between two adjoining countries, Indonesia and Malaysia. Take a look here. These are data giving you the proportion of animal protein and plant protein from various sources from 24-hour recalls coded by the major food source of protein. Indonesia, much more plant proteins from cereals and beans, cereal and pulse. Malaysia, less pulses, less cereals, more potatoes. And look at the big difference in chicken, yellow, egg, and especially dairy, and smaller difference in the consumption of beef. So this is very interesting because this shows how Indonesia and Malaysia differ not only in diet structure, but also in socio-demographics of diet structure. Let's go to the next slide. And this slide will show you that Indonesia and Malaysia again differ in the proportion of animal protein, but they also differ in who is consuming that protein. There are, of course, going to be differences by island location in Indonesia and socioeconomic status in Malaysia. So this shows you that the so-called protein transition is both economics and social components. Actually, in Indonesia, fish consumption is now associated with islands, rural dwellings, and rather poor families. In Malaysia, chicken consumption is much higher now than the consumption of fish, which definitely did not used to be the case 50 years ago. So all of those countries are in transition, and the transition involves protein. Final slide on this topic. This is an illustration of Bennett's Law in the next slide. And here you see a plot of gross domestic product from the 2013 from the World Bank and how This is related to animal protein as percent of total protein. So you can see on the left that some of the highest income nations have reached what's called peak meat consumption. Meat consumption is not going up as far as when incomes go up, but poorer countries have ways to go. And you see the same plot on the right on the logarithmic scale, showing again that as incomes go up, so does the consumption of animal protein. But the next slide shows you that this animal protein does not have to be beef. In fact, it could be dairy. Milk and dairy are the original nutrient-rich foods, and chicken and pork are more sustainable from the environmental standpoint than beef. So dairy provides you with calories, high-quality protein, and complete amino acid profile, as well as with a nutrient matrix that contains calcium, potassium, magnesium, and phosphorus, and vitamins A, B2, and B12. So this could be actually an interesting choice for low and middle income countries undergoing nutrition transition. Again, the issue is to balance optimal nutrition with low environmental footprint and maximum affordability. I'll be coming to that point again. So let's go on to the next slide. Let me talk briefly about the cost of the protein, monetary and environmental, and there are ways, again, of developing metrics to assess affordable nutrient density and the cost of foods. Let's go on to the next slide here. And what I want to show you quickly is that very few foods have a lot of protein per 100 grams. On this slide, you see data from the United States Department of Agriculture, and you see plant and animal protein foods ranging from plant-based milks on the left, milk, yogurt, beans, peas, and legumes, going all the way to animal foods on the right. Of course, those proteins are not equal in quality. PDCAS factor is a protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, PDCAS, vary much higher for milk and eggs, and for meat from pork and beef, and for soy than from wheat and other cereals. So here is a slide showing you grams of protein. The next slide picks out dairy products. It picks out milk and yogurt and cheese. Let's go on to the next slide. And the next slide shows you that those proteins can be obtained in the United States for varying cost. For example, here, shellfish is of this scale in terms of cost, followed by lamb and beef, but milk and flavored milk and yogurt and beans and peas and legumes and cottage cheese are relatively inexpensive when it comes to the cost of protein. Of course, this is on the next slide. Milk and dairy provide you with more than just protein. In fact, here I have a slide showing that milk and dairy are the original nutrient-rich foods. In the American diet, dairy provides about 10% of calories, but it provides 60% of the dietary vitamin D, over 50% of dietary calcium, 30% of phosphorus, 30% of vitamin A, and about 30% of vitamin B12. So here you have calories, 10%, much higher nutrient density in terms of selected nutrients. And actually, obviously, milk does not provide you with dietary fiber, vitamin C, or iron, but it does have a number of valuable nutrients. And then my final slide, next one. There are ways of measuring the food's impact on the environment. I just started looking in that. The one point I want to make, as the point I started off with, is that animal proteins, let's go on to the next slide, actually do have a higher cost to the environment. So here you see again protein content on the horizontal axis in grams per 100 grams. Animal foods are by far the highest. There's going to be red meat, poultry, and fish. But then you have greenhouse gas emissions on the vertical axis. And note that animal proteins have got much more protein, but also by far the higher cost. So actually, again, milk and dairy, take a look, picked out in yellow, have less protein, but much lower environmental cost. And the environmental cost is not that far from plant protein foods, soybeans, pulses, nuts, and seeds. Everyone always contrasts animal proteins from red meat to plant-based proteins. Look at the position of milk and dairy. That's what I'm saying, is that this is the reason why milk and dairy can fit in the nutrient gap. Let's go on to the next slide. And here I want to talk briefly about the way forward. There are two applications or two approaches. One, we need to create consumer demand for healthier foods. People want to need healthier foods and they need to want to buy healthier foods. But at the same time, we need to improve the industry supply of healthier foods. We cannot have demand without supply or vice versa. So in the next slide, you see my prediction that global protein consumption will increase. It will keep going up. It will not increase in rich nations who are already at peak protein consumption, but it will definitely increase in many of the countries in South Asia and in Southeast Asia. Look at how this graph, based on FAO data, has been changing. So here, we absolutely have to improve the global food supply. Let's go to the next slide. And here, I'm going back to diet quality, adequacy, moderation, balance, and diversity. But now I'm adding some suggestions about what industry can do. First of all, let's start from the upper right. We need to look at high quality protein, dairy proteins, novel plant proteins, fermentation, plant-based beverages. At the bottom, we need to look at fortification and enrichment with vitamins and minerals. And then how about on the left, adding whole food ingredients, including dairy, to processed foods. And let's not forget moderation, top left, about the removal or reduction of the nutrients to the limit, trans fat, saturated fat, added sugar, and sodium. And there are a number of new technologies that can help us. So let's go to the take-home messages on the next slide. And let me just repeat what I've been saying. The four domains of sustainability are nutrition, economics, society, and the environment. Remember, there are four, not two. These four domains are not additive. There will be trade-offs. And then focusing on protein quality, it has become a major issue, and not only for the low and middle income countries. And as a source of high quality protein combined with essential nutrients, dairy may well be able to address the ongoing global nutrient gap. Take-home message, we do need healthy diets from sustainable food systems, and we need additional studies to explore the place of dairy in the ongoing protein transition and in global food demand. So I'm going to finish right here, and thank you for your attention.